History is often presented as a smooth and logical progression, a steady climb from simplicity to complexity, from scattered tribes to global civilization. We are taught that knowledge builds upon itself, that each generation inherits what the last created, improves it, and passes it forward. Farming leads to villages. Villages grow into cities. Writing emerges. Governments form. Empires rise. It feels orderly, almost comforting, like a straight road stretching from the distant past into the present. But when you slow down and look carefully, that road begins to fracture. The historical record is not continuous. It is broken, uneven, full of long silences where the story simply stops. Entire civilizations appear, flourish, and then vanish so completely that their absence feels louder than their presence. These are not small gaps caused by missing documents or lost artifacts. These are vast blank spaces spanning centuries, sometimes millennia, where millions of people lived, struggled, and disappeared without leaving behind explanations. Archaeology reveals these absences not as gradual declines, but as abrupt endings. Cities that once buzzed with trade and ceremony fall silent within a generation. Knowledge that took centuries to develop is forgotten so thoroughly that later people live among the ruins without understanding how they were built. Writing systems vanish. Technologies regress. Social complexity collapses into survival. Progress does not merely pause, it reverses. When we encounter these moments, history stops behaving like a story of advancement and starts to feel fragile, temporary, almost accidental. The unsettling question is not whether civilizations fall, because they always do, but how completely they can be erased. What happened during those lost centuries? Where did the people go? What knowledge died with them? And why does this pattern repeat across continents and eras? These shadows between historical chapters challenge the idea that our world is stable or inevitable. They suggest that what we call civilization is something that must be constantly maintained, remembered, and protected, or it fades faster than we expect. In this quiet space, where certainty dissolves, we begin our journey not to solve these mysteries, but to sit with them, to let the unanswered questions settle gently. Because these gaps are not just about the past. They are reminders of how close every society is to forgetting everything it knows. One of the most striking examples of these historical voids appears at a moment when humanity should have been at its most confident. Around the late Bronze Age, roughly 3,000 years ago, the world had become deeply interconnected in a way that feels surprisingly modern. Across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, powerful kingdoms communicated regularly, traded over vast distances, shared technologies, and depended on one another to sustain their economies. This was not a scattered collection of isolated cultures, but a tightly woven international system. Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, the city-states of the Levant, and the maritime traders of the Aegean all formed parts of a complex network that stretched from Central Asia to the Atlantic edge of Europe. Goods moved constantly: tin for bronze weapons, copper for tools, grain to feed cities, luxury items for elites. Writing systems recorded treaties, inventories, diplomatic marriages, and military alliances. By every measure, this was a high point of early civilization. And then, in what amounts to a brief moment on the historical scale, it collapsed almost everywhere at once. Between roughly 1200 and 1150 BCE, cities burned, palaces were abandoned, trade routes dissolved, and entire political systems vanished. Not declined, not reformed, but ended. The archaeological record shows layers of destruction stacked across dozens of sites, concentrated within a few decades. After centuries of continuity, the evidence simply stops. Writing disappears. Population numbers drop dramatically. Large urban centers empty out, replaced by small, scattered villages struggling to survive. For hundreds of years afterward, history goes quiet. This period is often called a dark age, not because nothing happened, but because we can no longer see clearly what did. The silence itself becomes the mystery. What makes this collapse so unsettling is how complete it was. Later, civilizations did not inherit the full knowledge of their predecessors. In Greece, the linear B writing system vanished entirely, and later, Greeks had no idea their ancestors had once written at all. Monumental architecture ceased. Long-distance trade networks broke apart. Even basic technologies regressed. It was as if the memory of how to maintain complexity had been wiped away. Scholars have proposed many explanations, none fully satisfying on their own. Some point to invasions by groups remembered in Egyptian texts as the Sea Peoples, shadowy figures who seem to arrive suddenly in the historical record. Others argue for climate change, prolonged droughts that would have strained agricultural systems and triggered famine, unrest, and migration. Still others suggest earthquakes, internal rebellions, or the breakdown of overcomplicated systems that could not adapt when stressed. What complicates the picture is that these causes may not be mutually exclusive. A drought can weaken states. Weakened states invite conflict. Conflict disrupts trade. Disrupted trade collapses economies built on specialization. Once enough pieces fail, the entire structure gives way. The Bronze Age world was strong precisely because it was interconnected, and fragile for the same reason. When one region fell, its neighbors felt the shock almost immediately. What remains haunting is that the people living through this collapse likely did not understand it any better than we do now. From their perspective, the world they knew was ending without explanation. Records from the final years show signs of desperation: emergency fortifications, rationing of resources, frantic administrative activity, then silence. The people who could have told us what happened were scattered, killed, or reduced to survival, carrying fragments of memory that would later become legend. When later cultures looked back, they remembered this lost world not as history, but as myth. Heroes, gods, and golden ages replaced bureaucracies and trade agreements. The collapse became a story because the facts were gone. This pattern repeats far beyond the Bronze Age. The same unsettling rhythm appears again and again. Complexity rises, stabilizes, then vanishes, leaving behind ruins and questions. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Civilization is not a permanent state. It is a condition that exists only as long as memory, organization, and cooperation are actively sustained. When those threads break, even briefly, centuries of knowledge can disappear. The Bronze Age collapse is not just an ancient disaster. It is a reminder that history does not guarantee continuity. It only records what survives. Everything else slips quietly into the gaps, waiting in the darkness between the chapters, where the story ends not with an answer, but with a pause that lasts for generations. Another great silence in the historical record opens much closer to what we think of as the foundations of the modern world. The fall of the Western Roman Empire is often taught as a clean ending, a date in a textbook, 476 CE, when the last emperor was removed and a new era began. But when you slow the story down, that ending dissolves into something far stranger and far more unsettling. Rome did not fall in a single dramatic moment. It unraveled, and as it did, something more fragile than political power collapsed with it: the infrastructure of memory. For centuries, the Roman world had been sustained by constant motion. Grain flowed from North Africa to feed cities. Taxes moved from provinces to the imperial center. Soldiers marched along maintained roads. Messages traveled by courier. Knowledge was preserved because there were scribes to copy it, schools to teach it, cities to use it. Literacy was not widespread, but it was functional, embedded in administration, law, trade, and engineering. When that system began to fracture, the consequences were not immediately visible. The buildings still stood. The aqueducts still carried water. The roads still stretched across the landscape, but the people who knew how to maintain them were disappearing. As cities shrank and trade faltered, the roles that required literacy became unnecessary. In a village economy focused on survival, reading and writing were no longer skills that kept you alive. They became luxuries, and luxuries are the first things to vanish in times of stress. Within a few generations, large parts of Europe forgot how to read and write entirely. This was not a conscious rejection of knowledge, it was neglect born of necessity. When populations collapsed and cities emptied, the fragile chain that passed skills from one generation to the next broke. Technical manuals existed, but no one could read them. Architectural knowledge survived only as long as builders trained apprentices. When construction stopped, so did the transmission of skill. Stoneworking regressed. Concrete recipes were forgotten. Multi-story buildings became impossible, not because people were incapable, but because the social systems that supported specialization no longer existed. Archaeologically, this period appears as a thinning of evidence. Pottery becomes simpler. Coinage disappears. Written documents drop from hundreds per century to almost none. Layers of dark soil accumulate over abandoned Roman towns, a quiet sediment marking decay rather than destruction. This is why the term Dark Ages, though controversial, still resonates. The darkness is not moral or cultural, it is informational. We simply cannot see. Entire communities lived, adapted, and created new ways of life, but they left almost no written trace. Their voices are silent, not because they had nothing to say, but because the medium that preserved speech was gone. What survived did so unevenly. In some regions, monasteries became islands of literacy, copying religious texts while much of classical knowledge was ignored or actively erased. In others, oral traditions carried fragments of the past in altered forms. Legends of giants, lost cities, and heroic ancestors replaced administrative records and historical chronicles. When later generations rediscovered Roman ruins, they often had no idea who built them or how. Amphitheatres became quarries, temples became churches or collapsed into pasture land. The memory of empire faded into myth. What makes this gap especially unsettling is how recent it feels. This was not prehistory. This was a world with laws, libraries, engineering, and international communication. And yet, within a few centuries, most of that complexity vanished. The lesson is quiet but profound. Knowledge does not persist simply because it exists. It survives only if it is continuously used, taught, and valued. When the structures that support it collapse, forgetting accelerates. The Roman world did not fail because people became less intelligent. It failed because the systems that allowed intelligence to be applied at scale disintegrated. Out of this silence, a different world slowly emerged. New political forms, new identities, new languages. Medieval Europe was not a degraded version of Rome, but something else entirely, shaped by centuries we barely understand. The transformation happened in the dark, unseen, undocumented. This gap reminds us that history is not just written by victors, but by survivors who retain the means to record. When those means vanish, entire eras slip quietly out of reach. And as with the Bronze Age collapse, the unsettling truth remains the same. Civilization can forget itself faster than it can imagine. And once that forgetting begins, recovery takes generations. While Europe struggled through its centuries of silence, another vast portion of human history was already slipping beyond recovery on the other side of the world. The Americas before European contact represent one of the most frustrating gaps in our understanding of the past. Not because evidence does not exist, but because so much of it vanished before it could ever be recorded in a form that survived. When Europeans first arrived, they believed they had discovered an empty wilderness dotted with small, scattered tribes. This assumption shaped centuries of historical thinking. Yet archaeology now tells a very different story. On the eve of contact, the Americas were densely populated, home to tens of millions of people living in complex societies with cities, trade networks, monumental architecture, and sophisticated systems of agriculture. What followed was one of the greatest demographic collapses in human history. Disease moved faster than conquest. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus swept through populations with no immunity, killing entire communities within a generation. In many regions, more than 90% of the population died. When the people disappeared, so did their history. Oral traditions that had preserved knowledge for centuries were cut short when elders died before passing stories to the next generation. Cities were abandoned, fields reclaimed by forest, roads erased by time. By the time Europeans moved inland, they often encountered ruins without inhabitants and monuments without memory. One of the clearest examples of this loss is Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis. Around the year 1050, it was the largest city north of Mexico, larger than London at the same time. It was a planned urban center with massive earthworks, ceremonial plazas, and astronomical alignments. Monk's Mound alone required the movement of more earth than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Cahokia was not an anomaly. It was part of a wider Mississippian culture that dominated much of eastern North America for centuries. And yet, by the time Europeans arrived, Cahokia had been abandoned for generations. The people living nearby did not know who built it. The history was already gone. The same pattern appears in the southwest, where the ancestral Puebloans built stone cities into cliffs and canyons, engineered roads across deserts, and aligned structures to celestial cycles. Sites like Chaco Canyon show a level of organization and planning that rivals Old World civilizations. Then, around the 12th century, these centers were abandoned. The descendants survived, but the specific details of why the cities were left, how authority was organized, and how the system functioned, faded into silence. In Mesoamerica and South America, written records existed, but many were deliberately destroyed. Maya codices were burned by missionaries who saw them as pagan. Only a handful survived. Entire libraries vanished in smoke, taking astronomy, history, and theology with them. In the Andes and the Amazon, civilizations relied heavily on oral tradition and materials that decay quickly in tropical climates. Recent technologies like LiDAR have revealed vast urban networks beneath jungle canopies, proving that what was once dismissed as untouched wilderness was carefully shaped by human hands. Raised fields, canals, roads, and settlements now emerge from beneath the trees, evidence of societies that managed landscapes on a massive scale. But knowing that they existed does not tell us who they were. We have structures without names, cities without stories, achievements without voices. The tragedy is not just the loss of life, but the loss of memory. Compared to ancient Rome or Egypt, which feel distant but familiar through texts, the Americas before contact feel close and unreachable at the same time. These were societies thriving only centuries ago, yet we know less about them than civilizations thousands of years older. The gap is not a mystery born of deep time, but of sudden erasure. It reminds us that history does not disappear slowly. It can vanish almost overnight when the conditions that sustain memory collapse. The silence left behind is not evidence of simplicity, but of catastrophe. And in that silence, countless human stories remain untold, waiting in the shadows of a past that should have been remembered. Beyond the Atlantic world, another vast silence stretches across a continent, whose past was long misunderstood and often deliberately obscured. Africa, frequently described in outdated narratives as a place without history, holds some of the deepest and most difficult gaps in the human story. This absence is not the result of a lack of civilization, but of how history was preserved, interrupted, and later dismissed. Many African societies recorded their past not in stone inscriptions or long-written chronicles, but in carefully maintained oral traditions. These were not casual stories told for entertainment. They were structured systems of memory, carried by trained historians who memorized genealogies, laws, migrations, and events stretching back dozens of generations. As long as social continuity remained intact, these traditions were remarkably precise. But oral memory, no matter how sophisticated, is fragile when confronted with collapse. When communities are destroyed by war, disease, or forced displacement, the chain breaks. And once it breaks, the history vanishes completely, leaving little behind for archaeologists to recover. One of the most striking examples of this loss is Great Zimbabwe. Rising from the hills of southeastern Africa, its massive stone walls were built without mortar from carefully fitted granite blocks. At its height around the 13th century, it was the center of a powerful kingdom controlling gold trade routes that connected the African interior to the Indian Ocean world. Thousands of people lived there. Its rulers commanded wealth that drew the attention of distant traders. And yet, when Europeans encountered the ruins centuries later, the city had already been abandoned, and its builder's history had faded from living memory. Rather than accept that indigenous Africans had created such a structure, colonial scholars invented explanations involving outsiders, Phoenicians, Arabs, or biblical figures. These myths were not harmless misunderstandings. They erased what remained of local historical knowledge and discouraged serious investigation into African civilizations on their own terms. A similar silence surrounds the kingdom of Kush, which flourished along the Nile south of Egypt for over 1,000 years. At times, Kushite rulers conquered Egypt itself and ruled as pharaohs. They built pyramids, developed complex religious traditions, and created their own writing system, known today as Meroitic. We can see the inscriptions carved into temples and tombs, but we cannot fully read them. Despite decades of study, the language behind the script remains largely unknown. Names and fragments can be identified, but the meaning of longer texts is lost. This leaves us with monuments without explanations, achievements without context. A civilization powerful enough to rival Egypt is reduced to a shadow because its own words remain silent. Further west, the Nok culture of what is now Nigeria presents another puzzle. Beginning around 1500 BCE, the Nok created sophisticated terracotta sculptures and were among the earliest iron-smelting societies in the world. They appear to have skipped the Bronze Age entirely, moving directly from stone tools to iron technology. This should have transformed our understanding of technological development, yet we know almost nothing about how Nok society was organized, what language they spoke, or why their culture eventually disappeared. Their art survives, but their history does not. Medieval West African empires such as Ghana, Mali, and Songhai were renowned across the Islamic world for their wealth and scholarship. Cities like Timbuktu housed libraries and centers of learning that attracted scholars from across North Africa and the Middle East. Yet much of what we know about these empires comes from external observers. Internal records were lost, destroyed, or never written in durable form. When colonial powers arrived centuries later, they showed little interest in preserving what remained. Libraries were looted or burned. Oral historians were dismissed. Children were taught that their ancestors had no meaningful past. The result was not just political domination, but historical amnesia. What makes these gaps especially painful is that much of this history is not ancient in the distant sense. These civilizations flourished within the last 2,000 years. In some cases, within the last millennium. Their absence is not due to deep time, but to disruption and erasure. Yet in recent decades, the silence has begun to crack. Archaeology across Africa is revealing complex urban centers, long-distance trade networks, and sophisticated social systems that challenge old assumptions. Linguists are working with surviving oral traditions, carefully reconstructing fragments of the past. New technologies are uncovering buried cities and forgotten landscapes. The gaps remain large, but they are no longer empty. Africa's lost centuries remind us that history is not lost because people failed to create it. It is lost when the systems that carry memory are broken, and when later generations choose not to listen. These shadows are not signs of absence, but of voices that were never given the chance to endure. Scattered across the largest ocean on Earth lies another of history's great silences, one that feels almost impossible when you stop to consider what it represents. The Pacific Ocean covers nearly a third of the planet's surface. a vast expanse of water broken only by small islands, many of them separated by thousands of miles of open sea. And yet, long before modern navigation, long before compasses, sextants, or maps, human beings found these islands, settled them, and maintained connections between them for centuries. By around 1200 CE, nearly every habitable island in the Pacific had been discovered and colonized by people traveling in wooden canoes, guided only by stars, waves, winds, and memory. It remains one of the greatest achievements in human history, and one of the least understood. The Polynesian expansion was not a random drift of people carried by currents. It was intentional, skilled, and systematic. Navigators crossed immense distances, locating islands that were sometimes no more than narrow strips of land, barely visible above the horizon. These voyages required extraordinary knowledge of astronomy, oceanography, weather patterns, and ecology. Navigators memorized the rising and setting points of hundreds of stars, read subtle variations in wave patterns caused by distant landmasses, tracked bird behavior, cloud formations, and even the color of the sea. This knowledge was passed orally from master to apprentice, generation after generation. It worked. For centuries, it worked so well that vast networks of islands remained connected through regular voyaging. Cultures flourished in places that modern observers once assumed were isolated and primitive. But by the time Europeans entered the Pacific in the 16th and 17th centuries, much of this knowledge was already fading. The great age of exploration had ended. Voyaging routes were abandoned. Canoes still existed, but the deep navigational systems that once connected the ocean were remembered only in fragments. In some regions, the traditions survived just long enough to be recorded in the 20th century by anthropologists working with the last master navigators. Even then, no one could be certain how complete that knowledge was. How much had already been lost? How many techniques, star paths, and mental maps vanished before anyone thought to write them down? The mysteries deepen when you look at specific places. Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, stands as one of the most haunting examples. Isolated, remote, and small, it somehow supported a society capable of carving and transporting massive stone statues weighing tens of tons. These moai were raised on ceremonial platforms with precision and care. The society that created them also developed a unique writing system, Rongorongo, one of the very few independently invented scripts in human history. And yet, we cannot read it. Most of the wooden tablets were destroyed after European contact, and the few that remain are undeciphered. We know the Rapa Nui people had writing, but not what they wrote. Their own explanations of their history are gone. Popular narratives once claimed that the islanders destroyed themselves through environmental collapse, cutting down forests until their society imploded. Recent research paints a far more complex picture, suggesting resilience, adaptation, and survival long after European diseases devastated the population. But without their written records, and with oral traditions disrupted by catastrophe, the truth remains incomplete. Another enigmatic site lies far to the west, in Micronesia, at Nan Madol. Built on a coral reef lagoon, this complex of artificial islands constructed from massive basalt columns is sometimes called the Venice of the Pacific. 92 stone islands connected by canals, covering hundreds of acres, assembled without metal tools or large populations. Construction began around 1200 CE and continued for centuries. It served as a ceremonial and political center for the Saudeleur dynasty, yet by the time Europeans arrived, it was already abandoned. The reasons are unclear. Oral traditions speak of overthrow and decline, but details are vague. The scale of Nan Madol raises uncomfortable questions. How did a relatively small island society mobilize the labor, engineering knowledge, and organizational structure required for such a project? And why was it left behind? Similar puzzles appear across the Pacific. Monumental stone structures in Tonga, star mounds in Samoa, fortified hill sites in Fiji, each pointing to periods of complexity and power that later dissolved into quieter forms of life. One of the most intriguing clues to Pacific history comes not from ruins, but from plants. The sweet potato originated in South America, yet it was cultivated across Polynesia long before European contact. Linguistic similarities between Polynesian and South American names for the plant, along with genetic evidence, confirm that contact occurred across the open ocean around 1200 CE. Someone crossed the Pacific, intentionally, successfully, and returned. But there are no written records of this journey, no stories preserved in a form we can verify. We know it happened, but not how or by whom. The humid climates of the Pacific are unforgiving to history. Wood rots, cloth decays, paper disintegrates. What survived best was memory, and memory is vulnerable to disruption. European contact brought disease on a scale that shattered societies. Entire island populations collapsed within a generation. When elders died, navigational knowledge died with them. Star maps vanished. Voyaging chants fell silent. What remains today are fragments, reconstructed through archaeology, linguistics, experimental voyages, and oral traditions preserved just long enough to be recorded. The Pacific's lost history reminds us that extraordinary human achievement does not guarantee historical survival. Even the greatest feats can vanish if the means of remembering are fragile. Across thousands of miles of ocean, people once moved with confidence and purpose. Guided by knowledge, we are only beginning to understand. Their world did not disappear because it failed, but because it changed, and because the systems that carried its memory could not withstand the shocks that followed. The silence that remains is vast, like the ocean itself, holding stories that were once alive and are now only faintly echoed in stone, genetics, and the stars. As we move deeper into these shadows, the pattern begins to repeat with such consistency that it becomes impossible to ignore. Again and again, human societies reach levels of complexity that seem stable, even permanent, only to encounter moments where continuity breaks and memory fractures. One of the most unsettling of these breaks lies buried far deeper in time, at the very threshold between what we call prehistory and civilization itself. Long before the first cities of Mesopotamia or the pyramids of Egypt, human beings were already far more organized, observant, and capable than we once believed. For much of the 20th century, the dominant assumption was that complex thought, large-scale cooperation, and symbolic systems only emerged after agriculture. First came farming, then surplus, then specialists, then monuments, then civilization. It was a clean, logical sequence, and then sites like Göbekli Tepe quietly dismantled it. Discovered in southeastern Turkey, Göbekli Tepe dates to around 9600 BCE, more than 11,000 years ago. That places it thousands of years before the invention of agriculture, pottery, or permanent urban settlement. And yet what stands there is unmistakably monumental. Massive T-shaped stone pillars, some weighing over 20 tons, arranged in carefully planned circular enclosures. The pillars are carved with reliefs of animals, abstract symbols, and human forms rendered with confidence and skill. This was not a temporary camp or a crude structure. It was a place of purpose, built through coordinated labor, sustained over generations. The people who constructed it were still hunter-gatherers, relying on wild animals and plants for survival. According to older models of history, such people should not have been capable of organizing projects of this scale. And yet the stones remain, silently contradicting the narrative. What makes Göbekli Tepe even more unsettling is that it appears fully formed. There is no clear evidence of a long developmental sequence leading up to it. No obvious earlier versions showing gradual experimentation. The site suggests that the knowledge required to quarry, transport, carve, and arrange these stones already existed. And Göbekli Tepe was not alone. Nearby sites of similar age hint at a broader cultural world that has almost entirely vanished from view. This raises a question that history struggles to answer. If hunter-gatherers were capable of monumental construction, symbolic art, and complex social coordination, what else were they capable of? And what might have been lost when their world ended? The timing is impossible to ignore. Göbekli Tepe sits at the very edge of a massive climatic upheaval known as the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions that began around 12,900 years ago and lasted for over a millennium. Temperatures dropped rapidly, ecosystems collapsed. Many large animal species went extinct. Human populations declined sharply. Cultures that had thrived for thousands of years disappeared from the archaeological record. The world did not ease into this change. It was abrupt, violent, and global. When the Younger Dryas ended around 11,600 years ago, the climate warmed again, and within a few thousand years, agriculture and the first civilizations appeared. The transition feels almost too neat, as if history had been reset. Complex hunter-gatherer societies vanish. Simpler survival strategies dominate. Then, suddenly, farming, cities, writing, and states emerge. It is tempting to see this as progress, but it may be more accurate to see it as recovery. A rebuilding from fragments of knowledge that survived catastrophe. Sea levels during this period rose dramatically as ice sheets melted, eventually climbing more than 100 meters. Vast coastal plains that humans had occupied for tens of thousands of years were flooded. These coastlines would have been ideal places for early societies to flourish, rich in resources, stable, and connected by water routes. Today, they lie underwater, inaccessible, their evidence scattered or buried beneath sediment. If advanced hunter-gatherer cultures existed before the Younger Dryas, much of their physical record would now be lost to the sea. What remains on land may only be the faintest trace of a much larger story. This possibility makes many researchers uncomfortable, not because it invokes anything supernatural, but because it challenges the neat boundaries we place around human capability. Our ancestors were not primitive in the way we often imagine. They had the same brains we do, the same capacity for observation, pattern recognition, and innovation. Given thousands of years of relative climatic stability before the Younger Dryas, it is reasonable to ask what they may have discovered, what systems of knowledge they may have developed, and how much of that knowledge failed to survive the collapse that followed. None of this requires lost super-civilizations or advanced technology beyond recognition. It requires only acknowledging that cultural complexity can arise in many forms, and that catastrophe can erase it almost completely. When later civilizations emerged, they may have inherited fragments of much older traditions. Astronomical knowledge refined over millennia, symbolic systems older than writing, stories passed down through survivors who no longer remembered their original context. These fragments could have seeded new developments once conditions stabilized. In this light, early civilization does not appear as a sudden miracle, but as a reassembly, a careful reconstruction built on whatever knowledge endured through the darkness. The Younger Dryas represents the deepest and most consequential gap in human history, not because nothing happened before it, but because so much may have been lost. It reminds us that our understanding of the past is shaped not only by what existed, but by what survived. Beneath our feet and beneath the waves lies a world we may never fully recover. A chapter torn out not by time alone, but by ice, fire, flood, and forgetting. When the climate finally stabilized after the Younger Dryas, humanity did not simply resume where it left off. The world that emerged was fundamentally different from the one that had collapsed. Coastlines had shifted, ecosystems had transformed, and population distributions had been radically altered. Small, scattered groups of survivors carried forward fragments of knowledge, traditions, and memory into a landscape that no longer resembled the old world. Out of this fragile recovery, something extraordinary began to happen. Within a few thousand years, human societies across multiple regions independently began to settle, cultivate plants, domesticate animals, and build permanent communities. This moment is often described as the Neolithic Revolution, but that word can be misleading. Revolutions suggest intention, planning, and foresight. What followed the Younger Dryas was less a deliberate leap forward and more a slow, uneven response to new conditions, shaped by survival, adaptation, and remembered experience. In the Fertile Crescent, people who had once relied on intensive foraging began to manage wild stands of wheat and barley more deliberately. Over generations, selective harvesting altered plant genetics. Animals that had once been hunted were gradually controlled, bred, and incorporated into human settlements. Agriculture did not appear overnight. It emerged through countless small decisions made by people who may not have fully understood the long-term consequences of what they were doing. Yet once it took hold, it changed everything. Permanent food production allowed populations to grow. Larger populations required new forms of organization. Storage created inequality. Ownership created conflict. Surplus made specialization possible. And specialization, in turn, created the conditions for writing, administration, and monumental architecture. What is striking is how quickly this process unfolded once it began. In Mesopotamia, within a few thousand years of the first domesticated crops, cities like Uruk appeared, housing tens of thousands of people. Writing emerged not as literature or philosophy, but as accounting, lists of grain, livestock, and labor. Civilization began as bureaucracy. In Egypt, along the Nile, a similar pattern played out, but with its own distinctive character. Seasonal flooding created predictable agricultural cycles, supporting dense populations along a narrow corridor of fertile land. Villages grew into towns, and towns were unified under centralized authority. Within a remarkably short time, monumental stone architecture and a fully developed writing system appeared. The speed of this transformation continues to puzzle archaeologists. Civilizations elsewhere followed comparable trajectories. In the Indus Valley, planned cities with advanced sanitation systems emerged. In China, early agricultural societies formed along the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. In the Americas, domestication of maize, beans, and squash supported complex societies that would later build cities without metal tools or draft animals. These developments are often presented as independent inventions, proof of humanity's inevitable progress. But the pattern is more complicated. Many of these early civilizations appear suddenly in the archaeological record, with fewer transitional stages than expected. Their systems of measurement, astronomy, architecture, and social organization often seem to arrive already refined. This does not mean they were copied from a single source, but it does raise questions about how much earlier knowledge may have existed in forms that left little trace. Memory does not always survive in stone or writing. It survives in habits, in seasonal rituals, in stories told around fires. Survivors of earlier collapses may have carried practical knowledge forward without preserving the context that explained its origins. By the time stable conditions returned, these fragments could be reassembled into new systems that felt innovative, even though they rested on very old foundations. This perspective changes how we view early civilization. Instead of seeing it as humanity's first awakening, we might see it as a reawakening, a second attempt shaped by loss. The early states that emerged after 10,000 BCE were not born into an empty world. They inherited landscapes altered by catastrophe and cultural lineages shaped by survival. Their myths of floods, lost ages, and civilizing ancestors may not be pure invention. They may be distant echoes of real experiences, compressed and transformed by time. Understanding civilization this way also forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Progress is not guaranteed. The structures we build, the knowledge we accumulate, and the systems we depend on are all vulnerable. The gap between collapse and recovery can erase more than we imagine. If the people who came before us lost entire worlds of understanding, then our own achievements are not as permanent as we like to believe. They endure only as long as the conditions that support them remain intact. The civilizations that rose after the Younger Dryas built the foundations of the modern world. But they also stand as reminders that history moves in cycles, not straight lines. Growth follows collapse, complexity follows simplification. And beneath every flourishing society lies the shadow of what came before, half remembered, half forgotten, waiting to be rediscovered. If there is one lesson that echoes through every lost civilization, every dark age, every vanished culture, It is this: history is not a straight line. It loops, fractures, and resets in ways that are often invisible to those living through them. By the time a society realizes it is in decline, the forces that will erase it are usually already unstoppable. Looking back across the gaps we have explored, a pattern begins to emerge, one that is unsettling precisely because of how familiar it feels. Complex systems grow efficient, interconnected, and powerful. They generate surplus, specialization, and culture. And then, under pressure, they fail not slowly, but suddenly. What survives is rarely the most advanced technology or the most beautiful art. What survives is whatever can be carried, remembered, and adapted. This is why so much ancient knowledge disappears. Writing dies when literacy no longer serves daily survival. Engineering is forgotten when cities empty and roads crumble. Astronomy fades when calendars no longer align with disrupted seasons. What remains are fragments, myths of floods, legends of golden ages, stories of teachers who came after catastrophe to set the world in order again. To modern ears, these stories sound symbolic, even fanciful, but across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, the themes repeat with eerie consistency. A great destruction, a time of darkness, survivors scattered, knowledge lost, then renewal. These are not comforting myths meant to entertain. They are cultural scar tissue, memories encoded in narrative form because no other method of preservation survived. When archaeology uncovers sudden discontinuities, abandoned cities, lost scripts, and unexplained regressions, it is tempting to search for a single cause: a war, a drought, an invasion. But the truth is usually more complex. Collapse is rarely monocausal. It is the result of stacked vulnerabilities. Environmental stress combined with economic fragility, political instability layered onto social inequality, external shocks hitting systems already stretched thin. This is what happened at the end of the Bronze Age. This is what happened after Rome. This is what happened in the Americas after contact. And it is likely what happened many times earlier, in periods for which we have no names and no records at all. What makes this realization uncomfortable is how closely it mirrors the modern world. Today, global civilization is more interconnected than at any point in history. Supply chains span continents, information moves instantly, specialized knowledge underpins everything from food production to medicine to energy. This complexity gives us power, but it also creates fragility. Disruptions cascade, failures compound. A shock in one region ripples outward, affecting systems thousands of miles away. The past is not warning us through prophecy, it is warning us through precedent. The gaps in history are not anomalies, they are the norm. Long periods of growth punctuated by abrupt collapse, followed by centuries of recovery and reinvention. We remember the peaks because they leave monuments. We forget the troughs because collapse destroys the very tools needed to record what happened. This creates a distorted view of human history, one that overemphasizes continuity and underestimates loss. It is comforting to believe that we are the endpoint of a long, steady progression, that each generation builds securely on the last. But the evidence does not support this narrative. Instead, it suggests that humanity repeatedly climbs, falls, and climbs again, often losing vast amounts of knowledge in the process. The fact that we are capable of rediscovering what was lost does not mean the loss was insignificant. Entire ways of understanding the world may have vanished forever, leaving us to reinvent solutions without knowing they once existed. Yet there is also resilience in this story. Despite repeated catastrophes, humanity endures. People adapt. Communities reform. Knowledge, even when reduced to fragments, becomes the seed for something new. After the Younger Dryas, civilization returned. After the Bronze Age collapse, new cultures emerged. After the fall of Rome, Europe slowly rebuilt. After the devastation of the Americas, indigenous cultures survived against overwhelming odds. The story of lost history is not only a story of failure, it is also a story of persistence. But persistence does not guarantee preservation. What we choose to record, protect, and pass on determines what future generations will know about us. The silences in the past exist because systems of memory failed. Libraries burned, teachers died, languages disappeared. If there is a responsibility implied by studying these gaps, it is this: understanding that knowledge is not self-sustaining. It requires care, and without that care, even the most advanced civilization can become a rumor, a ruin, or a mystery that future scholars argue over in the dark. When we step back and look at the full sweep of human history, what stands out most is not how much we know, but how much has vanished without leaving a trace. The past we study is not the past as it was lived. It is a fragment, a survivor's version, shaped by accident, preservation, and loss. For every civilization we can name, there may be others we will never know existed. For every text we can read, there were countless voices that spoke and were never recorded. History, as we inherit it, is not a complete story. It is what remained after disaster, erosion, and forgetting took their toll. The gaps we have explored are not isolated anomalies. They are woven into the structure of the human story itself. Bronze Age kingdoms that vanished in a generation. Literate societies that forgot how to read. Cities in the Americas swallowed by jungle before their builders' grandchildren could explain them. Scripts that no one alive can decipher. Monuments whose makers left no names. These absences are not signs of failure in archaeology or history. They are reminders of how vulnerable memory truly is. Civilization depends on continuity, and continuity depends on stability. When stability breaks, memory breaks with it. What survives collapse is rarely truth in its original form. It is myth, ritual, and fragmentary knowledge, reshaped to fit new realities. Flood stories echo real disasters. Legends of golden ages remember lost complexity. Tales of civilizing ancestors preserve the idea that knowledge once came from somewhere else, somewhere earlier. These stories are not literal records, but they are not meaningless either. They are how humans carried information when writing failed. The danger comes when we dismiss these remnants as fantasy, simply because they do not fit modern expectations. To do so is to repeat the same mistake that erased so much history in the first place. The past warns us quietly. It does not shout. It shows us that no civilization, no matter how advanced, is immune to collapse. It shows us that knowledge can disappear faster than it is created. It shows us that progress can reverse, and that recovery can take centuries. Most unsettling of all, it shows us that people living through collapse rarely understand it as it happens. They experience it as confusion, shortage, migration, and loss, not as the end of an era. Only later do historians give it a name. Our own time feels permanent because every era does. Roads feel eternal until they are no longer maintained. Institutions feel solid until they stop functioning. Information feels infinite until the systems that store and transmit it fail. The past is not distant. It is a mirror held at an angle, reflecting possibilities we would rather not consider. And yet, there is something deeply human and quietly hopeful in this story as well. Despite repeated losses, humanity rebuilds. People adapt. Knowledge returns, sometimes rediscovered, sometimes reinvented, sometimes emerging in forms no one before imagined. Curiosity survives catastrophe. The impulse to understand the world does not die easily. Even when the record is shattered, future generations search the ruins, asking questions, trying to remember what was forgotten. That is what archaeology is at its core, an act of remembrance on behalf of those who could not preserve their own story. The shadows between history are not empty. They are filled with lives lived, choices made, and worlds that mattered deeply to the people who inhabited them. The fact that we cannot fully recover those worlds does not make them less real. It makes our responsibility greater. To question simple narratives, to accept uncertainty, to remain open to the idea that our understanding is provisional incomplete, and always evolving. As you let this story fade into sleep, imagine the countless human beings whose footsteps shaped the world before us. Farmers along vanished rivers, sailors crossing oceans guided only by stars, builders raising monuments whose purpose we still debate, storytellers passing knowledge mouth to ear, hoping someone would remember. History did not forget them because they were insignificant. It forgot them because forgetting is what happens when the fragile thread of continuity breaks. The past is not finished speaking. We are simply still learning how to listen.